Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Rektor, liebe Ruth, lieber Justus, herzlichen Dank für diese einleitenden Worte. Die Erwartungen sind tatsächlich jetzt sehr hoch gesteckt. Ein Wort vorweg, die Vorlesung wird in Englisch sein. Denn ein Punkt, der mir in Innsbruck ganz besonders gefallen hat, ist, dass viele Kollegen aus dem Ausland auch am Institut für Informatik tätig sind. Nicht jeder ist fachlich, oder ich kann nicht erwarten, dass jeder fachlich einem deutschen Vortrag folgen kann. Ich möchte meine Gedanken mit möglichst vielen teilen, deshalb habe ich den Vortrag auf Englisch vorbereitet. So, let me start in English. The topic is bits have no history, and to manage expectations, I'm going to show you first what I'm not going to tell you. So I'm not going to talk about all these spectacular data breaches, which you can read about in the media. Also, when you think of information security, most people think of secrecy, encryption, three-letter agencies. I'm not going to talk too much about that. On the other hand, we are computer scientists. Some people say, well, computer science is just a special case of mathematics. Mathematics is about numbers, so we deal with a lot of numbers. And in particular, in computer security, we need a special kind of numbers. We deal a lot with random numbers. So let's put up some random numbers here, and I hope that we can shed some light on these numbers during a talk. The third thing I want to mention is if you talk about computer security and computer science in general, you think of very technical topics. You think we need to really get down, also from the title here, to the bits, to encryption functions, to discrete mathematics. But the first slide that I usually show to my students in the main information security lecture is this one. It has nothing to do with technology. It's essentially a Renaissance painting of Cain and Abel, if you want. So the root of conflict, the very start of where humankind started to fight against each other. The initial speakers have already mentioned that it's a relatively young tradition to have information security chairs at computer science departments. And the rector mentioned that this is a new chair, it's a new special focus. So you may ask the question, why has information security become important over the past couple of years? All the foundational ideas have indeed been around since the mid-1980s. What is new is not that technology has changed that much. What is new is that humans have changed. Humans are putting the technology to use. So we carry our little computers in our pockets. We mediate. We have computer systems that mediate all kinds of transactions between people. So it is not the systems themselves that are insecure, that are vulnerable to attacks. It is the fact that the systems mediate interaction between people. People have different opinions. People have different preferences. We have 3.2 billion people connected to the internet. It is very unlikely that all of them have exactly the same preferences. So there will be conflicts between people, and these conflicts are carried into information systems. Now, what do information systems do at the very core? If we take a very foundational perspective, we need to contrast this genesis with another genesis. This is a picture of the very first integrated circuit. You see some semiconductor substance doped so that we can get more or less the functionality of one single transistor. It has created the revolution of storing digital data and enabled all these fancy things that now intermediate our social lives, that have enabled, if you want so, the internet and everything that we can imagine nowadays from computing technology. It is still and will for a couple of years remain the foundational unit of how we store digital data. So if you combine two of these transistors, you end up with a construction of gates, and what you can see here is probably the simplest abstraction of how we can store one bit in memory. So you have two NAND gates connected, and it's essentially a circuit. On the right-hand side, you have a picture taken with a microscope. This is not current technology. This is 10 years old technology, because with current technology, you don't get hold of the pictures. But it more or less looks like the same, just the scale has a little bit changed. And now if we add power to the circuit, then we see that these latch gate can essentially, or this combination of gates can essentially stay in two different situations. This could represent a 1 bit, and now if you pull off the R line for a second, then it switches to another stable state, which would mean it's a 0 bit. And this is the very reason why I chose the title for this particular lecture. Because what you see is that this circuit is stable in two different states, but as soon as you change the state back and forth, it loses entirely what is known about the previous state. So a single bit doesn't have a history. The world does not consist of a single bit. There are estimates that say that we have 10 to the 22 bits of digital data on this planet, and it is increasing at an enormous pace. Now, the important question for me from an information security perspective is, if those bits, some of those bits, represent facts that matter for real people, that decide about people's lives, then how can we make sure that these bits are authentic? So I'm going to talk in this lecture about more or less the protection goal of integrity. So how can we, the security technology, ensure that the information that we use, that our information systems use, is correct and has not been modified, rather than talking about the more popular topics of encryption and maybe availability. My notion of authenticity is also slightly different from what people consider integrity in classical information security. Authenticity for me is integrity plus some relevance to the real world. Because this is what matters for people. So to take a principled and foundational approach, the big question is, how can we, given the physical factors that bits have no history, engineer systems that allow us to ensure the authenticity of digital data? And I want to distinguish three different approaches. The first one is that we take more than 1 bit. We know other bits that already pre-exist, and we try to validate whether the bit we are interested in, the bit on which our decision is based, is consistent with the state in other bits. That requires, of course, that we have data acquisition processes, that we know a little bit about the data generation modes, and so that we know about the dependencies between bits and can use this knowledge, or these models if you want so, in order to validate. Our technical terms are passive authentication or forensic purposes. Another approach is to create a copy of that bit. And of course, if I would just have the same bit again, and I want to manipulate it in order to convince you that the state of the world is different, so essentially these bits are representing states of the world, then you would not trust me. What can I do about it? Well, I can entrust a third party with the value of that bit. That is what we increasingly do. Cloud computing has been a buzzword for the past 5 years. It's nothing else than taking values and storing them at some remote sites. That has advantages, but comes at a disadvantage that we also have to trust that remote site, that it keeps our bit correctly. Because nobody knows what happens if the remote bit shows something different. And your decision, or some decision that matters for your life, is taken based on some information unduly altered by the other party. And the third option is, that's the most complicated, as you can see from the illustration, is that we actually add additional bits, but we don't just copy the information, but we calculate the values of these bits in such a way that they carry cryptographic proofs about the original value of these bits. We call this active authentication, and active authentication enables us to build user-verifiable protocols. So we don't have to trust a third party. Maybe we involve a third party, but at least the third party is always carefully inspected by the person for whom the bit actually matters. So my plan for this lecture is to go through these three options and show you what kind of research we contribute along all these three dimensions. Let's start with validating bits from other existing bits. Let me start with a short detour. Unlike bits, people have history. And I know that Justus Peter has already shown you some of my history, but this is where I actually started to enter discrete data. And that is probably the time of an IBM XT. And I also explored the surroundings here at Innsbruck. Hard to imagine that a couple of decades later I would be standing here and holding an inaugural lecture. And the last picture is one that you already know. I don't know who leaked it to you, but I'm not so much concerned about confidentiality. But we are going to look very carefully at this picture later on. Apparently, and I think the rumor is true, we have evidence that this little bundle of white pixels represents some other instance of me. These were still pictures taken with analog cameras, with film. So there has been some cases where film or analog photos were manipulated, but it was much harder than nowadays with digital pictures. Digital pictures are prevalent. I think this is one of the remarkable developments of digital technology entering real life for the past 15 years. And so if we take an arbitrary digital picture, this is one that I took, downloaded from one of these platforms. So there's data that states that we got 1.8 billion photos uploaded and shared per day on the internet. So it's an enormous mass of data and an enormous mass of bits. And these bits are all correlated. Yeah? They are not fully random. So what we can do and what needs to be done is to exploit this information, this correlation information, to check the authenticity of digital photographs. Because digital photography has not only made it much easier to take pictures, it also has made it much easier to manipulate pictures. Also, our dean was able to, with probably a few steps, remove or alter that picture of the golden roof. And for example, if we look at this picture, it is actually a forgery. It is a forgery that has won an award for very plausible photo manipulation. This is the original, and if you compare the details, then you see that they took care of almost everything, including shade. They changed the place of this lantern, and plenty of other things. So one of my research areas is to develop tools that help us to identify forgeries in digital images, or to check whether digital images are authentic, or which device has been used to acquire them. So what I usually demonstrate is that we have 3 digital cameras here, which differ in their serial number only by the last digit. So they have been manufactured one after another in an assembly line. And if we take pictures, which each of them, of course I don't have the time to do this here, I've already done this last summer term in Innsbruck, and then people give me an arbitrary picture, and I can tell you with almost certainty which of the 3 cameras, same model, same brand, same produce, actually took that picture. You can imagine that this is very relevant for forensic uses, so when police investigations seize cameras and want to link the cameras, in particular the sensors, back to material found on the internet or elsewhere. Digital manipulation has also become an art. Only recently, there was an exhibition at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Modern Arts. And here's the catalog. The exhibition was called Faking It, Photography manipulated before Photoshop, and there is a second edition and a second exhibition upcoming that is describing the years after Photoshop. So Photoshopping is something that is very relevant. So why do we need to trust in digital images as a society? Well, we are increasingly using these digital images as pieces of evidence. For example, people could commit insurance fraud by sending fake pictures as apparently evidence to insurance companies and want to get reimbursement for damages that never happens. Also in science, in particular in natural sciences, there have been cases again and again where articles in renowned journals had to be withdrawn because apparently the evidence, for example, some photos of molecules and other test images had been tampered or had been manipulated. And so we need methods to check the authenticity of digital data. Also, if you look at society at large, of course, if you have court decisions and there are pieces of evidence in the form of pictures, then you want to make sure that the pictures are authentic. And even broader, the media forms opinion, which is kind of the basis for democracy. And of course, you don't want to have forgeries manipulate opinion and change the outcomes of elections. So there is a huge field. And over the past 10 years, I was kind of lucky of entering this field relatively soon. And there has been tremendous development. So there is an arsenal of hundreds of specialized tools. And let me just take this opportunity to show you one little iteration or one little addition that we recently contributed to this area. I'm again taking a picture that you already know. And in this case, it is, I need to give you a little bit more technical detail. It is an image that has been compressed with a JPEG format. So everybody who uses digital images with consumer cameras is probably aware of this JPEG format. So you have this .jpg ending. And if you look at JPEGs carefully, then you will find out that JPEG images have these artifacts. So actually images are cut into blocks, small blocks of 8 times 8 pixels, and then all these blocks are compressed individually. And then when you load the image from the JPEG format again, these blocks are recomposed to form the entire image. JPEG also allows users to adjust the trade-off between compression and image quality. So what you see here is the worst quality, but it's most visible here on the projector to actually see how JPEG artifacts look like. And the more we improve the quality, the less we have artifacts. On the other hand, of course, the image size also increases. A lot of forensic methods has dealt with detecting JPEG compression, detecting re-JPEG compression, checking the consistency of JPEG artifacts, so essentially proving the authenticity of digital data by looking at the consistency of these JPEG artifacts for which mathematical models exist, if the compression quality is sufficiently low. Because you can think of it as requantization on shifted grids, and of course you will always have histogram bins that get overpopulated, other ones that get very empty, and you can extract some information from that. If you go to very high quality images, and of course with cheap storage we have more and more high quality images on the internet, it gets increasingly difficult to use these forensic techniques. So we needed to find a technique that not only evaluates the marginal statistics and the quantization bins from low quality compression, but we needed to find something that looks at all the dependencies, highly nonlinear dependencies, between the pixels in an 8 times 8 block. And there is a nice observation, and without getting into too much mathematical details, I can show you how it works. We are looking at, and we have been developing the concept of block convergence. So let's take one of these blocks. So that's an 8 times 8 block. That is in the original image. And now suppose we compress it with JPEG. JPEG does nothing else as transforming the pixel values of that block into a digital signal frequency domain representation. Let's just visualize it this way. Of course, it's much more complicated, hard to visualize. So think of this as a DCT representation of the same signal, and again rounded to integers. When you decompress from that form, you end up with a block that looks almost the same, but not exactly. So on the right-hand side, you have a difference image or a difference block where you can see highlighted pixels which have changed between the original and the first decompressed version. When I talk about convergence, then we probably have some iteration. So we could try to store this as a JPEG again and decompress it again. Once again, we see that there are some differences. And we could show that actually all well-behaved blocks more or less converge at some time. That means we reach a state where there's no difference anymore, even if we recompress. Now, the picture does not consist of a single block. Instead, we can calculate this convergence path for many different blocks. So this, for example, converges at time t equals 2. Now, like proper computer scientists, we start counting with zeros, so 0, 1, 2. And you could have other cases that converge already at the beginning. So that would be t equals 0. Yet another block converging after t equals 2. And here, just to complete the example, another case with t equals 1. Now, after we have determined the convergence depth or the convergence path for each block in an image, we can calculate a distribution. And here again, without showing the rationals behind it, I claim, and that is empirically supported, that the convergence properties of blocks, JPEG blocks, are largely independent of the image content. So what you see here are the statistics taken over 1,600 images, and on the x-axis you have the number of recompressions, so that's exactly the t that I showed you before, and on the y-axis you have the ratio of blocks that are stable at so many recompressions. And what you see from these box plots is that we have fairly small intervals, and the intervals are also distinct. So just from computing that ratio of a given image, we can determine how often it has been recompressed with JPEG. In another way, we learn quite a bit about the history of that image. Because you could have hypotheses about how the image forger first took the image, stored it with or got it in JPEG, forged it, stored it as JPEG again, and then potentially the blocks surrounding or the little baby on the original picture have a different convergence property than the ones around it. We have done this, and of course we can use this. I'm using the same picture. Unfortunately, I didn't get hold of the Dean's picture before, otherwise I could have put this in. So what we do here is now we look at how, or I'm going to illustrate which blocks in this image are stable. So stable blocks are marked with this little square. And so far, I'm just doing the analysis for the bottom half of the image, and you see that this is a pretty homogeneous treatment. Now, if we extend it up to the top of the image, we see that apparently the gold is not authentic. So somebody has modified it to make it a little bit more shiny. So this is exactly what happened here, and our methods are able to discover pretty accurately this kind of local tampering with images. When I researched a little bit about the golden roof, and that probably explains the next number on the random number slide, and then I heard that there are 2,600 fire-guided copper tiles. Unfortunately, there are different sources. I have not found out the reason why some sources report exactly 81 extra tiles. I don't know whether these are reserved tiles or whether it's because they count half tiles differently or fractions of tiles. So that is definitely something that needs to be researched in Innsbruck. So this was the approach of validating bits from looking at correlated bits, knowing or having models of the data generation process. Now let's swap to the next option. What happens if we entrust our bits to a third party? That is a very attractive option because we know that the price of cloud storage per gigabyte is really, really low, so it could be very convenient to keep copies elsewhere and then compare this to the original image, to the original value. What we do here, and we have a particular research project that is about to finish, is we are trying to measure and to verify data protection properties of keeping data with cloud providers. So this is a very important question because how can you entrust that party that it really deals data in a way that it is supposed or contractually agreed upon? The project is called Verimetrics, and it has a huge consortium, so of course we contributed our little pieces. I don't want to go into all the details, just give you a flavor of what we were doing. So we went from an analytical model over designing an architecture for the service provider's infrastructure. What was a particular goal, and I think this is interesting for this project already from the beginning, was that we can do continuous measurements. So you don't have like audits at certain points in time. We have seen from recent examples in the automobile industry, and that it's very important to test continuously rather than having specific test cases. And that was kind of anticipated here in the Verimetrics project. We have application scenarios until a software architecture that can already measure quite some data protection properties of data that is outsourced in the cloud. To give you just a flavor of one of the many metrics that are researched, I want to highlight a problem that is particularly topical right now. You might all have realized that only a couple of days ago, the European Court of Justice has essentially declared the Safe Harbor Agreement void. The Safe Harbor Agreement would allow companies to, in particular big American companies, to take Europeans' data, personal data, and transfer it to the United States. So what is important now is, from a technical perspective, whether we can measure or somehow find indications of the location where our data is processed in the cloud. The approach that is taken here, and we are very lucky to have partners who have a pretty decent cloud infrastructure. So this is a map of all the data centers of our partner. And what we did is we deployed probes in these data centers to extract networking characteristics, which would allow us to verify and estimate the location of the data processing. For those who know a little bit more about the architecture, of course, this works on a virtual machine level, so we are using the infrastructure as a service model of cloud computing. Cloud computing has many different facets, so not everything what I'm saying here can be generalized to the kind of cloud computing that you're doing, like, for example, storing data on Dropbox or Google Drive. And what we get is we get a feature representation, and without bothering you with too many technical details, let me just show you what happens if we project that feature space onto a two-dimensional plane using some multidimensional scaling. Then you can see that it is pretty distinct. So these machine learning algorithms actually allow us to identify different locations from the measured networking locations. This concludes the part on cloud computing. Already the subtitle that I chose here, Moving the Problem Around, shows you that I'm not super convinced of cloud computing as the solution of keeping our data authentic. What we really want is something that potentially combines storage at third parties with stronger techniques that allow end users to verify what's being done with the data. And that happens with active authentication. Active authentication is very complicated. I don't have the time here and don't want to bother you with how it actually works, but I think I have chosen an example, something that others have invented. It's 20 years old, but it's an example that gives you a flavor of what we are doing. Suppose we have two people who only communicate over a telephone line, like this here. And they want to flip a coin that decides, for example, about who wins and who loses a particular item. What can you do? Well, you can communicate over the telephone line and say, well, let's say the left person says, I'm going to toss the coin. You can predict what the outcome is. Oh, sorry, you lost. So this is the simplest possible example where you have like two parties connected with an information system, and they have conflicting interests. Everybody wants to win, and the system as such right now is not able to resolve the conflict. Because you could either let one party or the other party toss the coin, and both, of course, have the vested interest to make them the winner and the other one the loser. Of course, if you repeat that game, you would also let the other party win a few times, so that it appears more natural. But the core of the problem is not solved. So how does cryptography add to solve that problem? What we do is we introduce some randomness. We roll the dice on both sides, and both parties agree, or both parties come up with some random numbers. And now they agree on a one-way function. What is a one-way function? A one-way function is a mathematical function that is reversible, but that is more difficult to compute in one direction than in the other direction. We have analogs of this from the real world. So for example, if you want to multiply just out of the top of your head, it is much easier than dividing. Or taking to the square appears to be much easier, take three-digit numbers, than finding roots. So there is already a little bit of asymmetry of human capability of calculation. Of course, unfortunately, these examples do not hold this way for computers. Computer algorithms can more or less solve these problems with the same order of computations. But there exist problems where also from computers it gets much harder to compute in one direction than in the other direction. And these are so-called one-way functions. I've given you one, for those who are interested in the details, one very simple example, like exponentiating in a prime field, whereas the inverse function would be a discrete logarithm that is much harder to compute than the function itself. So both parties take their random value and compute that one-way function and exchange the result of that computation. Learning the result of the one-way function of the random number of the other party does not reveal, without being able to invert that one-way function, does not reveal anything about the random number, in particular not about the coin flip. And then once these values have been exchanged, we can introduce a second protocol step in which the actual random numbers are exchanged. And then we have a convention, for example, that the parity of the sum of both random variables decides the coin flip, heads or tails. And now, of course, the party who lost, let's say it's again the one on the right-hand side, then they check whether the first value of the other party was correct. So that is possible because now with the knowledge of set A, you can again compute the one-way function, and you find out that the protocol converges and has been resolved fairly. This is a simple two-person protocol that resolves a conflict by distributing the control of that state. So the state is whether the coin is heads or tails to two parties. So we have this two-party relationship. In practice, of course, we are interested in much larger systems, in open systems where people can easily join and take part in the protocol. So we get more like a structure of this. And what is more, open systems allow also people, let's say this person here on the right-hand side, to change their mind and abandon the protocol. And we have to ensure that the protocol still converges so that abandoning at any point in time doesn't give one or another party an advantage. Now let these guys make a little bit of space for more people, so also more people can come in. And another difficulty that we face on the internet is that we have often weak identities. So that means we do not exactly know with whom we are dealing. That means people can enter that protocol with a different name. That already means we can't stick with bad reputation. Once you get bad reputation, you exit the game and you enter again, something we cannot do so easily in real life. On the internet, you can do that. And even worse, you can decide to join the protocol with many different identities. Nothing prevents you from creating a lot of fake identities and then all joining the protocol. And here now you have a set of nodes where 4 of them, so a decent fraction in this case, is controlled by one party. So you can think of it as a terracotta army working for you. And this is the reality that we are facing when we are building distributed protocols on the internet. And we want to converge on a state. What could be useful applications of having a protocol where we have an open system with weak identities, and we want to, at any point in time, more or less have a consensus of a joint state. And one way or one thing that we can do with exactly this solution is that we can form digital money. This has been done already. A popular example that probably everybody in the room has already heard about is the Bitcoin decentralized payment system, which kind of creates a currency for the internet. And that is overdue. If you think of what you can attach to an email, you can attach almost everything to an email, pictures, audio, videos, but you can't attach 50 cents. So there's still payments in the digital world are lagging behind, so it is overdue to cure that situation. So how does the Bitcoin system work? Essentially, the Bitcoin system is nothing else than a big ledger where transactions are recorded, transactions between weak identities, so people can come up with as many account numbers as they want. And these bit sequences that are essentially stored in this distributed system are considered valuable. Not because technology made them valuable, but because there is a social consensus to ascribe value to these bit sequences. If you ask yourself how much value is ascribed to such bit sequences, that explains the next random number. It's 3.2 billion euro is the value of all bitcoins in circulation if you take current market rates to exchange them into conventional currency. And why can we ascribe value to bits if these bits can be easily altered without history? Well, because the distributed system ensures that everybody who takes part in the system can verify the complete history of a Bitcoin until the time where it was generated with a mathematical puzzle. So essentially adding cryptographic authentication, building distributed systems helps us to fix the problem of bits having no history, adds history to bits, and allows us such applications as digital money. We said we trace it back to a computational hard puzzle. I don't have the time here to exactly explain you how this works and why that works. What we know is that we can estimate how much electricity is used for this Bitcoin system. And that's quite a bit. It is 175 megawatts constantly. That's about factor 2 of what the city of Innsbruck uses, including transportation, including industry, not just households. So it's an enormous environmental and also financial cost that keeps the system, this global transaction system, running. And one thing that, of course, we have to look at as researchers is how can we either reduce that cost or get most of benefit for society at large from this investment. This is essentially what we contribute to in research. I don't think what many enthusiasts of these virtual currencies think that every cup of coffee is going to be paid at some point in time with a Bitcoin. That would mean that it becomes history because it's somewhere in this huge transaction ledger of the system. So actually what we also have here in the background is a very nice visualization of the history of Bitcoin. You see that there are lots of hubs, and so these lines between them reflect transaction flows. You also see these concentric circles representing different rings of years, so it visualizes history very well. And the generators of this visualization also attach color. And one important remark is that red color signals that these are businesses that are deemed illegal. So there are shady sites selling illegal goods or offering other kinds of illegal services. Money laundering is a main concern in these virtual currencies, which are hardly governed. So one of our research projects, actually the German-Austrian research project, is exactly about helping enforcement in virtual currencies and thinking about regulation approaches to virtual currencies that respect the spirit of virtual currencies, but at the same time discouraging this kind of crime. Now, if not every cup of coffee is going to be paid with in Bitcoin, why do I still think there is potential for this technology? Well, let's quickly switch into how the internet is constructed and what essentially makes the fabric of this internet. The internet is nothing else than a big bulk of routers, all interconnected. So we know actually from a bug that appeared for a couple of months ago that there must be more than 512,000 routers forming the backbone of the internet today. And these routers do nothing else than taking packets, storing them, and forwarding them towards the final destination. But the question we may ask is, why actually do routers do that? Or why do the operators, the owners of these routers, offer the service? Well, because it costs them electricity, it costs them capacity, so there may be bottlenecks at some point in time. You may also ask questions like, let's go to the service providers. Let's say, what does motivate this web server to respond to requests or to respond to all requests in a similar vein? For service providers, they have the same trade-offs, plus in many cases they also are exposed to all kinds of legal risks. Why do they take these costs for little return? Well, actually they don't. If you connect people in networks, then people extract different kinds of value from the very fact of being interconnected, from transacting via that network. But the costs and the benefits are not equally distributed. It's like in society. Costs and benefits of contributing to public goods in society are not always equally distributed. So in the real world, we have found lots of mechanisms that try to balance that. Economists call this internalizing the externalities. In internet protocols, this hardly ever happens. Many people think of that altruism, best effort of the internet pioneers has created the internet in a way that it is that we can observe it today. What happens behind the scenes is that we have essentially two approaches that refinance our infrastructure. One is paying with money. This is what happens in the backbone. So there are out-of-band arrangements, payments essentially. And of course, what this requires is that there are contracts, slow-moving devices between strong legal entities. So big internet services providers negotiate about the contracts. And once they change a little bit, there's a lot of politics involved. Only this week, only today, I think there was a decision in the Technology Committee of the European Commission, of the European Parliament, to rule about net neutrality. So it's a highly political way of dealing with these externalities in networks. And then we see another way of solving the compensation question. This is paying with data and with attention. This happens if you have user-facing web services. User-facing web services collect a lot of personal information in order to market or in order to monetize this information elsewhere, potentially in the future. This also comes with a lot of problems. First, there are very few socially acceptable options to monetize personal data besides targeted ads. Targeted advertising is a huge market. And there are serious privacy issues that people are worried about. And another thing, if you think a little bit about industry and competition, then monetizing personal data is always something that favors the big players against the smaller players. So eventually, it stifles innovation. So the vision here is, and this is what we have been discussing also with people who engineer internet protocols, is that we build protocols, network protocols, that support some in-band micropayments to essentially balance these externalities, to compensate the router for each individual packet or for bulks of packets and so on. You may ask, okay, well, if it works in the current internet infrastructure, why can't we stick with contracts? Why can't we stick with the situation as it is today? And let me just show you one picture. This is a typical device of sensor networks that is going to be all around in 15 years' time. So we will have a much denser connectivity of many more devices that are even less controlled and managed by people. So we need automatic ways and we need protocols that internalize the externalities in these scenarios. And all the problems that I mentioned are going to be exaggerated. Yeah? There will be less energy because these run on battery. Yeah? So it will be even more expensive to just forward a packet out of favor. Bandwidth will be scarce. Capacity is scarce. So let me go back to the overview. I think I have conveyed to you in my opinion, 3 fundamental ways of ensuring the authenticity of digital data. And I could highlight to you where my research team, my colleagues, and I are trying to contribute little steps to actually build a world in which the conflicts that emerge because people are connected to networks are resolved. So that leads me to recapitulate to what we have already on our website. This is kind of our mission statement. We are committed to develop and evaluate. So it's not about only theories. We really want to get our hands dirty and put things into practice. Technical components for information infrastructures. That, and now comes a very important part, for principled reasons. So we have the right methods and the right tools to justify why we take a certain design decision. Resolve potential conflicts. That is the desirable case, or in the very best case, avoid them altogether. This is the end of my inaugural lecture. I thank you for your patience. I also want to thank all my colleagues around the world, also those who are here. It is a pleasure to work in an exciting team. My colleagues for welcoming us all in Innsbruck so warmly, and my family for the patience and the support. Yeah, there's one thing open at the very end. What is this 180 among the numbers? That is true. It also happens to be the number of pieces of finger food that is now waiting for you at the buffet. Thank you very much.